From the very first moment the rancher pushed open the weather-beaten cabin door that night, everything he believed about loneliness, mercy, and destiny cracked open like dry earth under sudden rain. Because lying unconscious on his bed, the one no one had touched since his wife passed, was a young Apache woman whose life was hanging by a single thread, whose presence would soon turn his quiet world into one of impossible choices, painful reckonings, and unexpected second chances. And long before he knew her name, long before her strength returned, long before her dark, earnest eyes looked into his with a message that would shake him to his core, he had already altered both their futures with one reckless, compassionate act. She had whispered it much later, with the calm certainty of someone who had climbed out of death twice already, that by giving her shelter, by giving her warmth, by letting her sleep in the bed that had once held his whole world, he had stepped into a promise he didn't yet understand. A promise that would demand courage, love, and the kind of faith he thought he had buried years ago. If you believe in kindness, in redemption, and in giving people a second chance, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to channel name. It helps us bring more stories like this to life. The rancher, Eli Redstone, had lived alone for 5 long years after his wife succumbed to a fever that swept through the valley. His ranch had become a kingdom of silence, just the creak of barn doors, the low bellow of cattle across dry fields, and the restless wind scraping against wooden fences. His neighbors knew he wouldn't accept company, he'd mastered the art of grief in solitude. But solitude doesn't stop the world from finding you. It doesn't keep storms from wandering across your land. And it doesn't prevent broken, desperate people from collapsing at your doorstep. The storm that night had been merciless, sharp winds carrying dust and needles of cold rain across the plains. Eli had gone outside to secure a loose door on the shed when he saw tracks in the mud, prints light as though made by someone half-starved. They led toward his house. He followed them slowly, cautiously, knowing that out here, anything was possible. Someone fleeing. Someone hiding. Someone wounded. When he entered his cabin and saw her collapsed on his floor, shivering, barely conscious, he felt something in him drop, not fear, but recognition. She looked like someone who'd been running not just for days, but for years. He carried her to the bed he hadn't slept in since his wife died. The sheets had remained folded, untouched, ghost-white reminders of a life he could no longer bear to remember. But that night, he unwrapped them, replacing the cold memory of loss with the warmth of necessity. The Apache woman was young, but not fragile, even half-dead. She had an air of unbroken strength about her. Her face was drawn with exhaustion, her lips cracked, her long hair heavy with rain and dust. But her breathing steadied when he covered her with blankets, and something inside Eli steadied along with her. Over the next 2 days, she drifted between sleep and wakefulness. Eli fed her broth, wiped away the fever's sweat, and gave her water in small sips. She said little, but her eyes watched everything, the walls, the chair he sat in, the way he moved like a man accustomed to caring for others even when he pretended he wasn't. Her presence filled the cabin with unfamiliar life. Eli felt a strange stirring in his chest, equal parts worry and something he couldn't name. When she finally rose from the bed, her steps were unsteady but determined. She examined her surroundings not like a lost visitor but like someone reclaiming control of her fate. Eli told her she could rest as long as she needed. She nodded once, her expression unreadable, and continued to gather her strength, day after day. She began helping wherever she could, sweeping the floor, tending the fire, even stepping outside to gather kindling. She moved with quiet purpose, as if every action was a promise she intended to repay. Eli noticed her scars, on her hands, her arms, even her back, and wondered about the life she'd lived before arriving here. But she offered no explanation, and he asked no questions. Some wounds, he knew, needed silence more than answers. As weeks passed, something like companionship grew between them, not in words, but in gestures, in shared tasks, in the simple rhythm of living. Eli found himself eating at the table again instead of standing at the counter. He repaired a broken window so the cold wouldn't brush her asleep. She helped nurse a sick calf back to health, whispering soft, steady words to calm the animal. Her presence was a quiet return of color to Eli's gray world. Eventually, she told him her name, Nayeli. That single piece of truth felt like a door cracking open. She spoke little of her past, but Eli learned pieces through her silence. She had lost people, many people. She had endured harsh seasons, relentless pursuit, and the kind of loneliness that carves deep trenches in the soul. The world had not been gentle to her, yet she carried herself with a grace that made Eli ashamed of his own bitterness. The day everything changed was a quiet morning after the first spring thaw. Nayeli stood beside him near the corral fence, watching the horses move through the early light. She had grown stronger. Her cheeks had color now, her eyes no longer carried the flicker of constant vigilance. But her voice, when she finally spoke, was deeper, steady, resolved. She told him he had given her something she had not experienced in many years: safety, shelter, dignity. A place where her breath did not have to be measured by fear. She explained that the bed he had allowed her to sleep in, the same bed that had held his past, his sorrow, his ghosts, was not just a place of rest. To her, it was a profound offering, one that carried meaning her people took seriously. In accepting it, she had accepted him not as a stranger who offered charity, but as a man who had stepped into her future. Nayeli told him gently, without hesitation or embarrassment, that a bond had formed, one he might not have realized he'd created. Her culture believed that certain acts of protection forged an obligation between lives. And because he had given her care at a time when her spirit hovered on the edge of leaving this world, she wanted him to know her decision. She told him that if he was willing, she intended to remain with him, to build something new, to create life where death had nearly claimed her. Her words struck him like lightning through still air. He had not expected her to feel anything but gratitude, perhaps friendship, perhaps nothing at all. But she was offering something deeper, a future tied to his, shaped by both their losses, built from both their strengths. She spoke of children, not as a demand, not as an emotional trap, but as a promise of rebirth. Of continuing life. Of healing generations of hurt through new hope. Eli stood there, overwhelmed. He thought of his late wife, of the years spent grieving, of the belief that he no longer had a place in anyone's life. He thought of Nayeli arriving half dead on his floor, of the moment he lifted her onto the bed that symbolized everything he had lost. And he realized that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong about his story being over. The decision he made was not impulsive. It came slowly, through quiet days and nights of reflection. Through the realization that Nayeli's presence had reopened parts of his heart he thought would remain buried forever. Through the understanding that her life had been marked by sorrow as deep as his, and that neither of them deserved to walk alone any longer. In the months that followed, they built something small and steady. Trust. Respect. Partnership. They worked the ranch together, planting seeds in both soil and spirit. Eli taught her to ride. She taught him how to listen to silence, not as emptiness, but as the space where healing begins. Their connection was not a sudden blaze but a warm, growing fire that brought life back to the cabin. And the day she placed his hand gently on her stomach, telling him her body had begun the sacred journey they both now shared, he felt something inside him break open, not pain, but overwhelming gratitude. The ranch, once a place of weariness and ghosts, now held the promise of children whose lives would carry both their stories forward. Eli held her close that night, feeling the rhythm of a future he never imagined he'd have. And in that moment, he understood what Nayeli had meant the very first time she spoke those words, not as a declaration, but as an invitation into a destiny he hadn't known was waiting for him.